تقديم بروفيسور أنجيليكا نويفير ليس على سبيل الثناء، وهي لا تحب الثناء ولا التعظيم. هي أكبر أستاذ حي للدراسات القرآنية في العالم. عندها حوالي 20 كتاب، بس منهم 11 كتاب في الدراسات القرآنية. أنا تعرفت عليها عام 1981 في ألمانيا. هو العام الذي صدر فيه أطروحتها للهابيليتاسيون. الألمان عندهم 2 PhDs. أول PhD مثل PhDs تاعنا، ثم عندهم بعد 5 سنوات شهادة تأهل للأستاذية. لا يستطيع واحد أن يتولى كرسي للدراسات في العلوم الإنسانية إلا إذا كان عنده هذان PhD يعني. فهذه هي PhD الثاني. حتى تعرفوا نوعية دراساتها، PhD الأولى يسموها ديسرتاسيون بالألمان، ديسرتيشن، عن لتعرفوا أنها هي دارسة كلاسيكية أصلا، الكلاسيكيات يعني يوناني ولاتيني ولغات ثانية، عن كتاب لمبتا من كتب أرسطو في الميتافيزيقا. في الميتافيزيك تاعت أرسطو في ترجمته العربية وشرح رجل اسمه عبد اللطيف البغدادي. يعني اشتغلت على هذا النص اليوناني القديم مترجما إلى العربية كما شرحه أحد الفلاسفة العرب عبد اللطيف البغدادي. مشهور عبد اللطيف البغدادي بأمور أخرى، كتب مذكراته لأنه كان طبيبا وليس فيلسوفا فقط. كتب عن الطاعون في مصر، حدث طاعون هائل في القرن الخامس أوائل السادس، وكتب مذكرات ترجمة شخصية لنفسه، وعمل في شرح كتب أرسطو قبل ابن رشد يعني بحوالي 100 عام. فكانت هذه أطروحتها الأولى عن دراسة في شرح عبد اللطيف البغدادي لميتافيزيقا أرسطو. وهذا عملها الثاني، السور المكية في القرآن، دراسات في تركيب السور المكية من المرحلة المتوسطة. المستشرقون الألمان بدأوها، ثم صارت عامة، يقسمون السور المكية للقرآن التي هي حوالي 55% من سور القرآن، يقسمونها إلى 3 مراحل. السور الأولى المبكرة أوائل الوحي، ثم السور المتوسطة، ثم المرحلة المكية المتأخرة. بلشها واحد اسمه جوستاف فايل، ثم ثبتها نيلدكي، وصارت ثابتة في الدراسات القرآنية في سائر أنحاء العالم. فكانت هذه الهابيليتاسيون تاعها، وصارت هي التأسيس الجديد. هي في الأصل طبعا دارسة فيلولوجيا، هذه هي التاريخانية الألمانية، فيلولوجيا وتاريخ، لغات وتاريخ. لكنها من أوائل من ثار على الفيلولوجيا، واشتغلت على القرآن وعلى الأدب العربي القديم، وعلى على القرآن وعلى الأدب بمناهج أدبية. اقتربت قليلا من اللسانيات، ولكنها لحسن الحظ لم تبقى فيها. يعني هي هذا الكتاب من أتباع أو المدرسة البنيوية، دول اللي طالعين من الماركسية، صاروا يشتغلوا على النصوص إنه structuralism against Marxism، ولكنها لم تبقى في هذه المرحلة. خدمت القرآن كثيرا بالخروج من الفيلولوجيا إلى مناهج جديدة، لكنها لم تبقى فيها، وطلعت للمنهج الأدبي ومنهج نظرية الأدب، واشتغلت كثيرا جدا في دراسات تفصيلية. بسبب تخصصها في الكلاسيكيات فهي تعرف هذه المناهج القديمة وتعرف المناهج الجديدة في اللاهوت، في اللاهوت البروتستانتي وفي اللاهوت الكاثوليكي، وبالذات في اللاهوت البروتستانتي. يعني الذي يقرأها يعرف مدى عمقها في الكلاسيكيات وخروجها من هذه الكلاسيكيات، استخدامها لهذه الكلاسيكيات وخروجها منها. يعني أنتم لو تعرفون كم عانت هذه السيدة، لأنها تقريبا بقيت حوالي 20 عاما وحيدة. يعني أتى علينا فترة في أواخر السبعينات وحتى أواخر التسعينات ما عاد أحد يقول إن القرآن نص. ناس يقولون إنه تكون في القرن الثالث الهجري، ناس يقولوا محمد مش موجود، ناس يقولوا المسيح شخصيته أثبت تاريخيا من شخصية محمد، ناس يقولوا اجتمعوا القرآن العباسيين. يعني ألغيت الفيلولوجيا، ألغت نفسها الفيلولوجيا هذه، واحتجوا بالثورات في العلوم الاجتماعية وعلوم نقد النص وما شابه، وظهر جيل كامل أسسه 3 أو 4 في إنجلترا وأمريكا، ثم صاروا عشرات أو مئات الدارسين إنه يعمل نفسه فيلسوف، يقول لك هذا الطبري كل أخباره مزورة، زورها أهل السنة بعد 200 سنة، قاموا طلعوا تاريخ أول للإسلام مش موجود أصلا. بس بدأوا بالقرآن، وبالقرآن أحد 3 مذاهب، إما أنه وجد بعد 300 سنة من موت محمد إذا كان محمد موجود، أو أنه ترجم عن السريانية. محمد بلش بترجمته وهو ورقة بن نوفل أو شخصيات أخرى، ترجم عن السريانية، أو أنه هو كما كان المستشرقون القدامى ويقولون أنه خليط من اليهوديات والمسيحية السريانية. فبقيت هذه السيدة مع قلة قليلة جدا تقول طوال الثمانينات والتسعينات إن القرآن نص، وأنه ينبغي أن يقرأ كنص بغض النظر عن الإيمان أو الكفر. هو بيسمي نفسه بألف مكان أنه كتاب. فلندرسه من الناحية التاريخية، من الناحية النصية، من الناحية الأدبية، من ناحية الأخيلة والصور. ما بقي أسلوب من الأساليب إلا ودعت، وكانوا يعتبرونها ساذجة أو تقليدية، وأحيانا يعتبرونها مسلمة، وأنها يعني زعلانة من العلوم الحديثة وكذا. الآن طبعا تستعيد هذه الدراسات كلها قوامها بالمناهج الجديدة، بالإنجازات الجديدة، بالمراجعة لهذه فترة التخريب. لأن فترة التخريب هذه 20 عاما وأكثر لم تكن تخريبا من جهة واحدة، ما صار في تخريب من جهة المسلمين، هؤلاء المتطرفين المسلمين الذين جعلوا الدين كله والقرآن كله مجموعة من العقائد والعبادات يقتلون بها المسلمين أولا والآخرين. لذلك عملنا مؤتمرا اسمه إعادة بناء الدراسات الإسلامية، انتهينا منه قبل 3 أو 4 أيام هنا في الجامعة الأمريكية. إعادة بناء الدراسات الإسلامية ما عادش فيما يمكن دراسته، وعندنا المراجعين الجدد والنيو ريفيجيونيست، وعندنا الأصوليين المسلمين. هذا يعتبر كل الإسلام عبادات ويقتل المسلمين قبل أن يقتل غيرهم باسمها، وهذا يعتبر أنه ما فيش لا قرآن ولا إسلام ولا حاجة. يعني المعتدل جدا كان يقول أنه الإسلام مذهب سياسي وليس دينا. لن أطيل، آخر إنتاج السيدة نويفرت هذه الكتب الثلاثة حتى تشوفوا اهتماماتها في السنتين الأخيرتين، حتى تشوفوا اهتماماتها البحثية الجديدة وهي أفكار جديدة. هذا كتيب عن كيف ينشأ النص المقدس، كيف يظهر النص المقدس من ناحية التكوين ومن ناحية الاعتراف الكوديفيكيشن. كيف تظهر الكتابة المقدسة الدينية الإسلامية والمسيحية واليهودية، كيف ظهرت، كيف تكونت، وهذا منظورا إليه في ضوء الأبحاث الحديثة وفي ضوء التاريخ. هنا تبحث في هذا الكتاب الثاني، الكتيب الثاني، تبحث فكرة شديدة الجرأة، تسمي الدراسات القرآنية. هل يمكن الحديث عن فيلولوجيا سياسية؟ الإنجيل والقرآن وظهور الإسلام في ضوء الدراسات النصية القديمة ودراسات النصوص القديمة وفي ضوء الفيلولوجيا المعاصرة. إنما ذروة ما وصلت إليه في القراءات الجديدة للقرآن وبمناهج مختلفة هذا الكتاب الذي صدر قبل عدة أشهر فقط، اسمه سحرنة القرآن للعالم، القرآن وسحر العالم ونهايات السحر في التاريخ. Enchantement and Disenchantement. هذه أطروحة قديمة للفيلسوف الألماني يومانويل كانت، وتطورت في داخل الفلسفة الألمانية، ولذلك يتحدثون عن الانشانتمون وبعدين يتحدثوا عن disenchantment. هذا الفيلولوجي والأنثروبولوجي الفرنسي الكبير مارسيل غوشيه ألف كتابا 1988 مشهورا في ذلك، كيف يسحرن النص العالم وبالذات النص المقدس، وكيف يتواجه مع التاريخ أو يؤثر فيه ويتأثر به. هذا ما ستتحدث إلينا عنه من ضمن حديثها عن الظواهر الجديدة في الدراسات القرآنية. عندها أطروحة شديدة الهول، يعني حتى أنا ما جرؤت بعد على أن أقول بها. عند كتاب صدر قبل 5 سنوات، لا 2010، اسمه Quran and Late Antiquity. أنا عملت عليها نكتة، Quran and Late Antiquity. هذا مذهبها الجديد، شغلها الجديد، القرآن والكلاسيكيات المتأخرة. هي تزعم أن هذه النصوص المقدسة الثلاثة بالذات، بل والنص المانوي، ظهرت في العصر الكلاسيكي المتأخر، صارت كتابات مقدسة، بل صارت كتبا بين 5 والسابع للميلاد، بين القرنين 5 والسابع للميلاد. وهي عندها دعوة أنه هذا العهد القديم والعهد الجديد معتبرين كتابين أوروبيين، حتى نؤلف أنا أعتبر أن القرآن من هذه الكتب، هو كتاب أوروبي كما تعتبره موروثا للعهد القديم والجديد، هو موروث تأسست عليه أوروبا العصور الوسطى، القرآن من تأسيسات أوروبا في العصور الوسطى. يعني رؤية إشكالية. هذه مباحث الليت أنتيكويتي وتأثيراتها في العالم الحديث والمعاصر الآن شديدة الازدهار في الأنثروبولوجيا وفي التاريخ. هذا السحر، القرآن وسحر العالم أو سحرنة العالم، متابعة لهذه الرؤية التي نشرتها. الآن نحاول ترجمة الكتاب الأول، وهذا الكتاب نحاول ترجمته إلى العربية. الكتاب 2010 ترجم للإنجليزية، Quran and Late Antiquity، بس هذا بعد لم يترجم، ما يزال فقط بالألمانية. أترك الكلام الآن للسيدة نويفرت لتطلعنا على هذين الأمرين عن دراساتها القرآنية وماذا تريد أن تقول في هذا الكتاب بالذات. تفضلي دكتور.
شكرا يا دكتور رضوان. سمح لي يا دكتور رضوان أتكلم بالإنجليزية
وأنا
لأسباب مختلفة وعديدة فأنا أشكره على ذلك. So I will in order to not to waste your time to try to
إذا في حد محتاج أنا أترجم لكم. لا تخجلوا، كل من لا إذا لم يعرف نقول للسيدة تحكي بهدوء وأنا أترجم.
So my title is identical with the title of the book that Dr. Radwan just mentioned, The Quranic Enchantment of the World and Its Disenchantment Through History or in History. The two terms enchantment and disenchantment have been adopted from directly from Max Weber. Max Weber, the social philosopher of the beginning of the 20th century, who was particularly interested in the disenchantment, in the reversal of the enchantment in secularization in modernity. But he did dwell also on the older phases of religious history or history of religions and defined enchantment as the situation in primitive religious thought when the world, the empirical world, was imagined to be permeated by supernatural powers. So the world wasn't in no way a mere empirical phenomenon, but was imprinted, informed by supernatural powers. Now, it is due to the biblical prophets to have brought.
عم تسمعوا.
I don't know.
ما في هذا مش ضابط هذا؟ لا. تعرف؟ تست. ما صرخت معي.
سوء الحظ.
كمل.
Okay. So, who brought Weber ascribed the merit of having brought order into this somewhat chaotic, enchanted world of the primitive imagination by establishing a covenant between man and God, a divine covenant, and by establishing a kind of two-storied edifice, which is made up of the empirical world and the spiritual world, which overarches it and which also governs the empirical world.
أنتم انتبهتوا ماذا تقول؟ تحكي عن العشاء الأخير في التقاليد المسيحية وفي العقيدة المسيحية الذي التقى فيه المسيح بتلامذته فأعطاهم الخبز وشرب معهم الخمر وقال لهم هذا جسدي وهذا دمي. هذا هو المزج بين القدسي والمادي في مسألة سحرنة العالم. كمل.
So Weber dwelt with this, but he was more interested in the later phases, and particularly in what happened in late antiquity. Now, the enchantment of the Quran is very different from the enchantment that happened earlier on in the era of the biblical prophets, since the Quran, it occurred in late antiquity. I think I have to explain with some words what I mean by late antiquity. It is less an epoch. It's not defined by certain dates, but it is an epistemic space. It is a space where intellectuals, educated individuals of all provenances busy themselves with the same endeavor, namely to to revisit, to retranslate their canonical texts and traditions into under the perspective of a new ideology. The new ideology was centered around the experience that God is manifest in his words. The divine word, the Logos, started to play a very important role in this time. And perhaps I should give you an example to show what is intended. They started to retranslate their canonical text, including the Bible, into a new text. The first verse of the Hebrew Bible is known to all of you, I think, is in the beginning, God created heaven and earth. Now the translation of the 3rd century, or one of these translations, was to say that God, not in the beginning, but with the help of beginning, and beginning is his word, his creational imperative, his word be, kun, with the help of be, he created heaven and earth. So they established, these theoreticians established a second power next to God, and he is considered manifest in that word, firstly and primarily. And we have, if you look at the Quran is also imprinted by this consciousness that the word of God is his most dignified manifestations. Think of Surah Al-Rahman. Ar-Rahman, Allama al-Quran. خلق الإنسان, who were first articulated, the old compassionate articulated the word. The Quran is the word par excellence. Articulated the word and then created man. So the prevalence, the primacy of the word is clear in the Quran as well. And there are many other instances. The most important, perhaps, example for the enchantment of the world by the word is the construction of a scriptural universe. The Quran is in a way presented as a kind of text made up of signs, of ayat. It is the creation is another text, which is of course informed by the word, and the ayat, the signs, can be understood like vectors, like indicators pointing at the spiritual world that is overarching the empirical world. So this is very, very important for the Quranic innovation of the world. Now, of course, such thinking was not unique in late antiquity. If you look into Syriac writings, you find similar ideas, although not extended in this kind of, or condensed to one image. But there is another, I would like to turn to another indicator of the enchantment of the world in the early Quran, and that is what I call the so-called rational or epistemic eschatology. It sounds very complicated, it's not very complicated. In the late antique centuries, until the appearance of the Quran, are considered a time of crisis, of political, of ideological crisis. Why? Because at that time people expected that the end of the world was imminent, was very close, was very near. And there was much talk in the ideologies of the Jews and the Christians, even of pagans, about the circumstances of the last day. And you also have in the Quran, on first glance, it looks as if the Quran also was part of this ideology, that the last day is very close and we have to focus the alam as-sa'a, the signs of the coming of the last day. You have these clusters of sentences, of phrases, starting with إِذَا سَمَاءٌ فَطَرَتْ وَإِذَا نجوم انتصرت, and so on. There are quite a number of surahs.
إذا الشمس كورت، إذا السماء انكدرت، إذا النجوم انكدرت.
This is part of the sounds as if it was part of the ideology of the time. But when we look closer at these Quranic passages, we see that all these indications of chaos, of the chaos that will come about very soon, that this is outbalanced by something unique that no other religious tradition has to offer, namely the promise that in the end, reason will prevail. علمت نفس ما أحضرت.
ما قدمت وأخذت وعلمت نفس ما أحضرت.
So the promise, which is in the end of this cluster of either phrases, in a way outbalances the chaos that is announced by the indication or by the promise that reason will be prevailing in the end. Man will be entitled to know in what situation he is. This is completely different from all these ideological predictions of the last day in the neighboring traditions. We have to, in Quranic studies, my particular intent to stress the revolutionary elements. When, of course, the Quran has to offer a lot of ideas that we find in the Bible, find in the post-biblical literature, but there are some revolutionary ideas that we find that you don't find anywhere. The Quran is a response, it's a rectification, a correction of, particularly of these ideological predictions of chaos. So this would be another example of enchantment in the early surahs. Now, I use the word enchantment with reference to Beba, but I'm also entitled to use it with reference to the Quran itself, because in the Quran you find the accusation quite frequently that the Prophet is a magician. He was accused to be a sahir, and his speech was accused to be sahrun mustamir, continuous practice of magic. What did the opponents mean with this? They felt that the prophetic speech turned the empirical world, the real world, into something beyond itself, that points beyond itself to the spiritual world. And they themselves could not accept this spiritual dimension of things, this sign character of things, and therefore felt that they were manipulated. The Prophet manipulated their worldview, which was no longer as convenient and comfortable as it had been before. Pagan worldviews are very different from monotheist worldviews, particularly in view of the absence of the last day, of the reckoning on the last day. So he was accused to be a magician. And so we are allowed to speak really of the enchantment of the world. And in addition, if we paraphrase what the opponents meant, the magic that the Prophet worked was, of course, magic of the word. It was sihr al-bayan. And some later theoreticians were not slow to notice this. And I wish to refer to Al-Jahiz, as Bilal already guesses. Al-Jahiz, who did not speak about late antiquity, but he didn't speak of Jahiliyyah, not either. He doesn't use the word Jahiliyyah. He uses, or he paraphrases something that we can call Asr al-Balagha, the age of rhetoric, the age of speech obsession. This is what Jahiz brings to the fore. And he has this classical, you know it, of course, the classification of the prophets and their miracles, where he says that Moses, who was sent to a people who were fond of magic, needed to work a magical miracle, the change of a rod into a snake and back. Jesus, who lived, is very smart. Jesus, who lived in a later phase of late antiquity, where Moses lived in antiquity, not in late antiquity. But Jesus already was a son of late antiquity, where science and rational thinking was desired. So he had to eclipse this scientific scholars, the medics, by not healing people, but resurrecting dead bodies. So this is another way of changing the world. Now, the Prophet Muhammad would not have impressed anyone by such physical demonstrations of his power. He needed, in view of the obsession of his audience with rhetoric, with speech, with poetry, he needed to bring a rhetorical miracle, which is the Quran. So in a way, Jahiz confirms what I'm just trying to say, that late antiquity was the age of speech, of language, of rational thinking. So well, in our title there was the promise that Rahma should also play a part in what I want to tell you. Until now, the early Meccan surahs are not interested in Rahma as a notion, as a mafhum. Yeah? They are interested in justice, because the last day of judgment, will bring about justice. Now, what about Rahma? Rahma comes in the second Meccan period, in what we call the second Meccan period. It's difficult to date it, but with one surah, one particular surah, namely Surah Maryam. Well, this is not a surprise, since Maryam is already, before she enters the Quran, she's already clad, let's say, in a kind of garment of Rahma, because in Christian tradition, and she comes from the New Testament Christian tradition, she is called Maria Plena Grazia, Mary or Maryam Mubtaliat Ni'ma. This is her. Yeah. So she is already imprinted with this virtue that she is going to represent. Now, in Surah Maryam, you have 23, I think. I'm not so strong in statistics, but 23 references to the root Ra Ha Mim, and this is unique. Some of them are due to the use of the divine name Ar-Rahman. Ar-Rahman becomes a divine name for a period of time and replaces Allah and Rabbuka. And there are 7 surahs where Ar-Rahman is the divine name. Maryam is one of them. So, but what is far more interesting is that Maryam in that surah plays a very outstanding role. She is, let's say, she is the symbol of maternity. She enters the scene as a young woman who conceives a child, then she is pregnant, then she gives birth, then she carries the child to her family. So all the time she is concerned with the relation to her newborn or not yet born child. And it seems that since Rahma is derived from Rahm, which is the female womb, that Mary is really the representative of this particular virtue. And the surah...
Rahma Rahim.
And the surah goes on to tell stories about other parental relationships, Abraham and his son and his father, and others more, and also Zachariah. But what is important is that once this virtue or the mafhum, let's say, it's the notion of Rahma, it's the anti-notion, let's say, or the counter-notion to justice. Justice alone is not sufficient. It needs to be a Rahma. This starts to be interesting for the Prophet Muhammad and for his community at a certain time. And there is another very, very prominent Rahma surah, Al-Fatiha. Al-Fatiha is perhaps the most important Rahma surah because it endowed the entire Quran with informed the entire Quran with the notion of Rahma. Its first verse, the Basmala, becomes the in a way, is the prelude to all the surahs. All the surahs are preluded by, prefaced, so to say, by the Basmala. And so Ar-Rahman and Rahma is omnipresent in the Quran from that time onward. Before, it seems to have been different. Now, scholars have looked at the Fatiha as a kind of counter, let's say, as a kind of match or a counter version to a very famous Christian prayer. The Fatiha is not only a surah, it's also the ubiquitous prayer in Islam. So it matches in a way something in Christianity called our Lord's Prayer, which starts,
يعني
أبانا
الذي في السماوات يتقدس اسمك ليكن ملكوته. نعم.
Come on. So now they have wondered, of course, or they have missed, as usual. Scholars always complain to miss something. They missed this extremely intimate relationship between God and man as father and children in the Quran, and claim that there is nothing comparable in the Quran. Now, if you look closer at the Fatiha, I think there's nothing really missing, but I would say there's something very interesting that not only matches, but perhaps eclipses the Christian version, and that is Raf al-Alamin. If you look at Raf al-Alamin closely, it is, how do we translate it? It has received many translations. Some people translate it as the Lord of men, Lord of humans, Lord of all beings. And then you have also people, Lord of the worlds. Of course, in terms of lexicography, Dr. Ramzi, it has to do with worlds. And it doesn't say Rab al-Nas, but Rab al-Alamin. And yeah, yes. Good that it comes from you and not from me.
ما تخاف.
أنا لا أخاف. No, but no, it's really, I think it should be taken as a contractive form of alamiyin, yeah? And then it becomes very easy to solve the enigma, because alamiyun is someone who belongs to alam, yeah? And in the sense that Dr. Ramzi just said, the olam, which is that means both worlds together. It's this world and the other world together, and there is no need to say this world and the other world. Olam comprises both, and in late antiquity this was immediately understood. Man belongs to the two worlds. He has a kind of double citizenship in both worlds, which is also not there. It's not extant in any other tradition. The Christian tradition concedes to men that they have a relationship to the other world, but they are not yet citizens. They have to wait until the Ion, the millennium, has passed. Then they will probably become citizens of the other world. But in the Quran, it is a very, very much closer relationship to eschatology. And as an observer, I am not, have not been brought up in Muslim tradition. I am particularly admiring this dimension of Islam, this, let's say, this implicit or intricate presence of eschatology present in the real life. No? And it has to do with such verses which are very often repeated. Yeah? Man is a citizen of both worlds, and he hasn't to wait until he dies. He's already now. So I think this is, also a piece of rahmah, one could say. And I could, of course, enumerate a lot of other references to rahmah for instance, Surah Al-Isra, which is another very important Rahman surah. There you have, for instance, in the 10 Commandments, which are they're newly presented there. We have the commandment to respect one's parents, which has to do with Rahmah. You have to do this, to do good, be kind to your parents from out of Rahmah. And this is not there in the other traditions that also have the 10 Commandments. There they have nothing to do with an emotional in emotional participation of men in keeping these commandments. But in the Quran, it's the emotional commitment which has to play a role. You know the verse better than me. وَلِلْوَالِدَيْنِ إِحْسَانًا, and so on and so on.
وَبِالْوَالِدَيْنِ إِحْسَانًا, yeah.
Yeah, and there Rahma plays a role. If you want to recite the verse of the Rahman, you are most welcome. Anyhow, you will remember it by yourselves, I hope.
أخفض
من
لهما
الرحمة.
جناح الذل من الرحمة وقل رب ارحمهما كما ربياني صغيرا. 5 مرات يذكر الرحمة في العلاقة بالوالدين.
Yes. And well, Surah Isra, let us stay with it a little bit longer. I think it contains the most important proof of divine rahmah at all in the Quran. That is the visionary journey, the Isra. Yes. The Isra is, I think, a sign of divine rahmah. Why? For many reasons. Isra is the word that previously was used to denote Moses' exodus from Egypt, or his leading out Banu Israel from Egypt into freedom to the Holy Land. Now we have an Isra which is not a collective endeavor, but an individual experience of the Prophet, who is led out of the real world in Mecca to an imagined other world, which is called Masjid al-Aqsa. Masjid al-Aqsa, there's much controversy. Where is Masjid al-Aqsa situated? Nobody can decide that, I think, without discussing all the references. It is a sanctuary that is definitely not built of stone. Otherwise it would be a bait. It is a masjid. It is maybe a virtual sanctuary, probably a sanctuary for the angels. Angels don't need a building of stone to worship God. And we have in Surah Safat, we have Wasafati Safa, and then Taliyati Zikra, and we have the self-expression of the angels, Nahnu al-Musabbihun, in some place. So the angels are imagined to celebrate a divine worship, and maybe it is the place where angels worship God. It has to do with the Holy Land, الَّذِي بَارَكْنَا حَوْلَهُ, is one of the descriptions. So it is in a way located in the neighborhood, in the close to the Jerusalem sanctuary, but not necessarily rooted in the earth of Jerusalem. Maybe the heavenly Jerusalem.
Yeah.
In Jerusalem, of course. Heavenly. So. Now, what is interesting and what is most surprising about this verse, which I think is a key verse of the entire Quran, is that it is one of the few examples where you can date a Quranic verse. Usually the Quran is silent about chronology, it's silent about names, and here we have a political event that we need to associate with this surah, or at least with this ayah, and that is the conquest of Jerusalem from the Byzantines by the Sasanians in 614. 614, Jerusalem was occupied by the Sasanians, by the Persians, who reinstalled the Jews in the administration of the city, and in a way seemed to turn the status quo, which had given the prevalence to the Christians, turned this status quo around. And this aroused a number of preserved. We know the text, we have the text, can read the text ourselves, aroused a lot of apocalyptic speculations. On the Jewish side, Zerubbabel and others, they predicted the coming of the Messiah very soon. On the Christian side, it was the parousia, the return of Christ to fight the evil forces and so on. So there was an uproar in a way, which must also have touched the Meccan listeners of the Prophet. we should not imagine that they were totally isolated from what happened in Bilad al-Sham. No? So the question was now, to whom is Jerusalem? In whose dominion does Jerusalem fall? Is it Byzantine Christian, or is it Jewish, Sasanian Jewish, or something else? And the Quran votes definitely for something else, namely not belonging to any human dominion, but being aloof, being a spiritual sanctuary, Al-Masjid al-Aqsa. And this is what became, or perhaps already was, we don't know exactly how to decide this question, the direction of prayer, the qibla of the community. And there are quite a number of verses in Surah Al-Isra. If you look closely at the text, you see that there is, for instance, the recommendation given to the worshippers. They should, before they start to pray, they should say a kind of implication of kind of prayer, additional prayer. Give me to asking for a sound exit, مخرج صدق, and a sound return into it.
أدخلنا مدخل أخرجنا مخرج أدخلنا مدخل صدق وأخرجنا مخرج صدق واجعل لنا من لدنك سلطانا نصيرا.
And this, of course, this refers to the ihram, to the ihram where the worshipper is absent from this empirical world and is for a while is been transferred to another orbit, and we can perhaps identify that with the direction of prayer, which he has been following. That would mean that he or she also, like the Prophet, experienced such a transfer to the imagined Al-Masjid al-Aqsa. And I have a very interesting testimony by a contemporary, you of course know, Dr. Ridwan, and this is Omar Hamdan, who writes in some place that when he prays, he feels after a ruq'ah that he is going on an Isra. Huh? So he feels that this
إسراء أو معراج.
No, Isra first.
لا يدعي النبوة يعني.
لا. So no, but I think this is an interesting testimony for the correctness of the interpretation that this meant a new situation for the community. And in political terms, of course, one could say that community by this aligning themselves or itself to Al-Masjid al-Aqsa, which in a way is Jerusalem, is of course on earth, geographically spoken, it is Jerusalem. And if even it was in heaven. By aligning itself to this sanctuary, they in the end eventually had gained a center. They had before been quite decentered in Al-Hijaz, where no religious center for monotheists was extant. So they had gained an access to this center. And this gives me a good introduction into, or a good opportunity to leap to our second part. I don't know how much time I will have. I have to speed up. No?
عندك ربع ساعة 10 دقائق ربع ساعة.
إذن we need to reach the disenchantment of the world. Until now, everything was about enchantment, of changing the world completely into a new spiritual realm. Now, the disenchantment has also
new world view, new Weltanschauung.
Definitely. But now the disenchantment, what is it like? I mean, it has to do with the Masjid al-Aqsa. There are many, if you imagine that community that had existed as a pious group of worshippers, all of a sudden, or more or less all of a sudden, became a political unit. There is, of course, the necessity to organize the empirical world with innumerable regulations, and all these are in a way measures to earth the erstmal spiritual Weltanschauung to rationalize it and connect it to the empirical sphere. This had to happen. They had, in a way, in such a situation, they had to shift to a new relationship to reality. It was no longer the spiritual reality that was prevailing, but they needed to also to cope with the real challenges. And one of the first reform measures that were undertaken was the abolition of the Jerusalem Qibla. We cannot date the Medinan surahs exactly. The Medinan surahs are complex units, and it's difficult to decide when exactly a verse was revealed. But this seems to have occurred quite early, in the time when there was still a verbal exchange with the Jewish groups in Medina. A peaceful exchange.
The first 2 years.
Yes,
22,
definitely.
24.
Yeah. And so this measure belongs to the earlier reform measures undertaken then. And what does it mean? And all of a sudden, the Qibla to Jerusalem is replaced by the Qibla to Mecca. Yeah? I can only speculate, and I'm not sure, but it may be the case that this is the right explanation. The Jewish group in Medina was very well educated, and they knew the newest interpretation of the Bible. The Bible itself, the story that is at stake here is the story of the Akedah, of the binding of the son, or the preparations that Abraham took to sacrifice his son. This story in the Bible is a story of Abraham's piety. There's nothing political about it. It is not said that the son that he's going to offer as a sacrifice will be the progenitor of the Jews. No. But, and so in the Quran, it's also Surah Safat, where the story is briefly told, and there is no hint of at any political dimension in implication. Abraham is preparing the sacrifice, and he does it because he is an extremely pious prophet. Now, in Medina, people learned that this was not the entire story. According to rabbinic interpretation, this story is the etiology for Jerusalem's belonging as a symbolic center to Judaism and only to Judaism, because the sacrifice, according to the rabbinic interpretation, took place on the site of the Jewish temple. Indeed, it was the altar that Abraham raised was the foundation wall of the Solomonian temple. This is not biblical. This is an interpretation. The sacrifice is told as a story that took place somewhere else, but it was transferred to Jerusalem. Now, it is also very national. It has a very national, let's say, genealogical dimension, because the son who was sacrificed was the progenitor of the Jews alone. I mean, it's not Abraham alone, it's Isaac, who has nothing to do with the Arabs. So there was to highlight Isaac also meant to make it over clear that here only the Jewish people was at stake. Now, of course, in such and the Jews were directing themselves, orienting themselves to Jerusalem in their prayer. So it's difficult to imagine that one shares such a prayer direction if this is laden with nationalist or national and genealogical implications. And therefore, I think, it was necessary to rethink this Qibla. And what came about was a renunciation of the Qibla. This can, of course, be taken as a kind of concession. I would rather say it was a declaration of independence, because with this with this changing to a new center in one's own homeland, and with one's own, based on one's own traditions, the community became a real independent new religious entity. What did they need to do this to fill the Meccan tradition with national and political significance? The story was rewritten, let's say. The story was, it happens very often in the Quran, happens in all religions, nothing special. The story had to be rethought. The Meccan story was extended by a long verse, which needs to be a secondary extension, which says the thing happened, the following story happened when the son that Abraham had been praying for such a long time, and in the end he was born, when he reached the age where he, together with his father, could perform the sa'i, could take part in the Hajj. Abraham was, in the Quran, is the founder of Al-Hajj. So the story is now chronologically located into a time where, into the Hajj period, yeah? And the son is old enough to partake in the Hajj, and so the entire sacrifice story becomes, in a way, the foundation story of Mecca, yeah? Because where else could this have taken place? Must have taken place in the vicinity of Mecca. So it becomes the foundation story, the etiology of the sanctity of the Meccan sanctuary. And this, I think, affirms that there is a close relation between the claim of the Jews to Jerusalem and the renunciation of the Masjid al-Aqsa as the destination of the prayer by the new community, which is not a concession. In my view, it is the independence. Because from then on, they were really had their own center, were no longer dependent on other centers. Well, this is a disenchantment, of course, because what they now had, what the community now had in their hands or had at their disposal, was no longer a masjid, or not so much a masjid than a bait. No? The Kaaba is called a bait al-Haram. It's also a masjid al-Haram, but it is really it is intended as a temple, as a bait. And it is no longer in heaven, but on earth. And the disenchantment means to drag things out down from the heavenly, from the transcendent sphere into the empirical sphere. Now, I think this event is a prominent example for the disenchantment. I don't understand. Let me close. My time is over.
No, you have to speak 5 minutes about this Quran antiquity, about what Quran is a European book.
Okay, but let me first say that I do not understand disenchantment as disappointment. Yeah? I don't think that we need to look at the disenchantment of the rationalization of belief, yeah, which earlier on was very much concentrated on the upper level, which now embraces or encompasses the empirical world. I don't think that we have to take this as a kind of disappointing. Many scholars have condescendingly and disdainingly commented on that, that this was a kind of giving up. But this, I think, is the wrong approach. I find this a very interesting dynamic process that led to the states that we have. And in the end, I don't think that the Masjid al-Aqsa was completely given up. The Masjid al-Aqsa is no longer mentioned as such, but I think that the imagination that there is a sanctuary in heaven has survived. Yeah? Although there is on earth a bait, there's also a sanctuary in heaven. And one of the most, I think, the most important verses of the Quran, at least it's the verse which has been quoted 3 times in the Dome of the Rock, which is Surah Muhammad 56, in Allah wal Malaika. God and the, yeah.
إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما.
This verse, in my view, presupposes a heavenly sanctuary where there are individuals who pray. These are the angels, God Himself, and of course they are not to be sought in a bait, but they are in a sanctuary, maybe al-Masjid al-Aqsa, and the affirmation of the rulership of the Prophet is due to such a prayer in al-Masjid al-Aqsa. This is what I find is one guideline that could be followed to make kind of political sense of the Quran.
And how do you want to make the Quran a European book?
Well, since the Europeans, or let's say the European historians, have long been monopolizing late antiquity. Late antiquity, of course, presupposes that there is antiquity in bold writing, antiquity, the golden age of European culture. This is thanks, of course, to the Renaissance movement, where antiquity was proclaimed to be the birthplace of the birth situation of European culture. This is, of course, a construct. I would claim this is the birthplace of Islam. But European historians usually take it for granted that this is their own heritage. And if you have visited European capitals, you will always find temple-like buildings that are museums containing antique artifacts. Because antiquity is celebrated as their let's say, their own time of national childhood, if you wish. I would say this.
Their identity.
Their identity. Now, I would say that since antiquity was staged, all that was achieved in late antiquity of writings by the rabbis, by the church father, by pagan philosophers, all this took place where? Not in Europe, mostly in the southern Mediterranean, some of it in the northern Mediterranean. But it's not it's not very convincing to claim that this is the exclusive heritage of Europe. It's the heritage of the entire primarily the Mediterranean world. And one should not be impressed by the monopolizing by some Western scholars until now, very many, monopolizing late antiquity for themselves. The claim could easily and equally be raised by Muslims that it's their past, and languages used then were not the languages that Europeans afterwards used, foreign languages for them too. So I don't see why one should decline late antiquity when it is one's own heritage. And I have, unfortunately, I didn't bring it with me, but I have a witness to this same view in the person of Samir Basir, who is not particularly interested in ancient history, but he laments about the forgetting, let's say the fleshing out of late antiquity in the self-understanding of Muslims. Because he claims that Jahiliyyah has unjustifiably taken the place of late antiquity. The pre-Islamic culture is not only Jahiliyyah. There is, of course, this Bedouin pre-Islamic culture, but the more comprehensive surrounding world was not Bedouin, but was civilized or urbanized Bilad al-Sham, mostly Bilad al-Sham civilization. So this is European, but this is also Islamic. Europeans need to look at that closer and not just be content with their acclaimed heritage without seeing that this was in the end the heritage of Muslims as well. So we belong in a way to the same basic origin. This is what I think.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
I didn't understand that. The last thing which you were talking about. So, in other words, you are saying that the civilization of Bilad al-Sham and Fertile Crescent and how we went through Africa, this is the antiquity of Islam. This is pre-Islam. It's not the Jahiliyyah. It is that is the old prehistoric Islam. Is that what you're saying?
لا هي عم تقول انه الانتيكويتي اللي هي اصل اوروبا، الثقافه اليونانيه والهنديه واللاتينيه اللي اسسوا لاوروبا، وهم في نفس الوقت اسسوا للاسلام. الجاهليه العربيه جزء من الانتيكويتي اللي عملت اوروبا، والتي ظهرت فيها الكتابات المقدسه، حيث الورق صارت اللوغوس، صار رمزا. وهذه الكتب المقدسه كلها كتب لوغوس ومنها القران. يعني الجاهليه هي جزء من الانتيكويتي، ما يسمى بالجاهليه التي عندها نيجاتيف ايكو. لا، ينبغي ان لا تكون يعني النيجاتيف. الجاحظ ادرك ذلك فلم يعتبر الجاهليه امرا سلبيا. تفضل.
Well, I think I came to the end.
You came to the end. ما بدك توضحي لنا الست.
No, I think she is completely right. The lady is completely right in saying that this past is Islam's past as well. With the same right, it can be claimed by Muslims, or by Middle Easterners, as it can be claimed by Europeans. And it hasn't happened until now. This is due, in my view, to the political monopolization of late antiquity by Western historians. Even Peter Brown, who is one of the outstanding founder of late antiquity studies, he doesn't really include Islam. And when he does, he immediately says that the Muslims, the early Muslims, in a way, they emulated the Christians, and for a while this worked, and afterwards it turned out they didn't fit. He, in a very unpolite way, rids himself from the task to reflect the relationship between Islam and late antiquity. I think Islam has a right to claim late antiquity because late antiquity is intrinsic to Islam. Many ideological, as I presented here, many ideological principles have been treated in the Quran, not always in a positive way, not always as examples, but as a challenge that needed to be responded to. The Quran itself is a prominently response to the challenges of late antiquity, and it is ununderstandable that this answer to problems raised in late antiquity, given by the Quran, has never been taken seriously, because this film cut has been installed according to which the Quran is something other, or Islam is something other. But Islam responds to open questions of late antiquity, as the church fathers did and the rabbis and so on.
هيثم، تريد أن تسأل شيئا؟ مين بده يسأل؟ في عندكم أسئلة؟ تفضل يا حسن.
في حدا
لا،
يبلغ.
في حد غيرك؟
حدا بيبلغ.
أنا كنت أتكلم في حد. نعم.
طيب اوكي.
تفضل.
You see, Rahma in Luke is also Na'ma, the translation of the Greek. So could it be the translation?
Blessing and grace, the same.
The same, يعني.
It's more or less the
It is
same.
also Lucan. And the second, you see by in Surah Maryam, the progeny is given as gift from God, as mercy from God, as a gift and mercy from God. Hiba wa rahma min Allah. The progeny
is a gift and mercy from God. And this is why Mary as a maternal figure plays a role in this as the maternal as a tool of rahmah,
Definitely,
as a tool of
definitely.
rahmah. So can we suggest and develop this a bit further and say that it's this rahmah is more a maternal fadila virtue?
Well, it's definitely
The
a
fact
very
that Abrahamic is very patriarchal.
Yeah. Well, I don't think that in that surah so that there's any tanaqud, any contradiction between the paternal and the maternal relationship. But definitely, I think that that rahma even replaced ni'mah perhaps by reasons for stylistic reasons, because the entire aim of the surah is to establish rahmah. So where in the places where other traditions have ni'mah, it was shifted to rahmah, which is not very dissimilar from it. And of course, I mean, it's inseparable from maternity and from femininity also.
It was taken later in Surah Al-Imran as the house of Imran and house of Abraham, putting in juxtaposition.
Yeah,
Yes.
there it always be in Medina. Everything is a little bit political, or much.
تفضل.
كان عبد الله العلي بيقول انه هذا الدين هو دين مرحمه مش بس رحمه، على وزن مفعله، لانه فيها معنى القوه اكثر، انه مكان ابتداع الرحمه. بيقول هذا دينه اكثر من مره سمعته عم بيقول لي عبد الله العلي دينه مرحمه. وبعدين ممكن كثير بهذا التحليل انه المرحمه هي تكون ايكوال للحب، يعني في يكون دين محبه، الرحمه هي السينونيم لحب يمكن عند المسيحيين، هذا ما عم نعمل دراسات مقارنه بين الدينين. وفي الرحمه والرحم والرحيميم اللي هي كمان نفس الجذر العبري القديم، انه لما حكينا عن الرحم اللي هو في كمان خلاف باللغه العربيه هل هو مذكر ام مؤنث. القدماء بفضلوا يذكروه والحديثين بفضلوا يقولوا الرحم مؤنث، بس عند القدماء بيقولوا هذا الرحم مذكر، وبيقولوا رحيميم هي نفس الكلمه اللي بيبدا فيها كمان سور من العهد القديم. ففي كثير هون تقارب بين المسيحيه والاسلام
بروفيسور بعلمك كيف بده يعمل ملاحظه لغويه.
اتفضل بروفيسور
كيف
بعد.
بدي اسال سؤال بس فعلا في واحد لان عباره رحم الابوه قد استعملت.
صحيح
انقطع رحم الابوه.
Yeah.
Completely lost its original sense. No, my question was, do you have any answer to whether, do you know when the word Rahman came to denote Allah for the first time? In which period did this come? And do you think there are other epithets which might replace also, like Al-Qadir?
Well, we all know that Rahman was extant. No? There are some divine names that have been extant, perhaps in South Arabia. Not perhaps, definitely in South Arabia. And as Christian Robin has shown, there are quite a number of names also of the pagan goddesses, no? That go back to South Arabian origin. So there was, of course, it was not only Bilad Sham, the second homeland of the community, but also South Arabia. And why this name and when exactly? I mean, we cannot date Surah Maryam, but before Surah Maryam, the epithet is not used. And afterwards, after Surah Al-Isra, also, I mean, Rabbuka and Allah become frequent and current again. But the name and then there's even the verse where it says, name him as you like. Lahu al-asma al-husna. The Quran has a very let's say, liberal relation to names, whereas in other religions the use of name, the articulation of God's name is already haram.
We have in the Sabbaic inscriptions from the 5th century, 5 or 6 times in the inscriptions comes Ar-Rahman. And they said the people who are writing that, they were Jews. But when the Quran mentioned Ar-Rahman in Medina, the Jews were not pleased. They are not. It is not our God. It is not monotheistic what you are saying. God is just and is not blessing. Just is, it means he must be the Jewish God. They were not pleased with the word Ar-Rahman, as if they don't know. Perhaps they came from Palestine, the Jews of Arabia, and not from southern Arabia. Yani they have different traditions. Anyhow, they were not pleased. While Christian Robin and other scientists, historians who are specialists in the Yemeni southern Arabian civilization, they said Rahman is a Jewish name by the Jews of Yemen in the 5th century.
Rahman, not Rahim.
Rahman. Rahmanan.
Nan.
Rahmanan. Al-Rahman. And in southern Arabian is Ar-Rahman. They as like Al. But the people of Medina, the Jews of Medina, they don't know them.
But Dr. Rahman, is that very important for us as exegetes of the Quran to know that
it is from the antiquity, why not?
Yeah.
It is important. It's from southern Arabian and from the northern Arabian
Yeah,
and from Mediterranean. You said that is all as a part of antiquity. Yemen wasn't in the antiquity.
No, I'm only afraid, when it comes to it's not your method. When it comes to reduce Quranic phenomena to archaeological, speculations, I become a little bit uneasy because I think the genius of the prophet.
The last question is for Hadi. Please.
الأول أنا هعلق على كلمة الرحمن من خلال comparative linguistic. الرحمن النهاية من خلال الألف والنون دي جاية من الأرامك بمعنى المنتمي إلى. كلمة الرحم يعني الفرق ما بين الرحمن والرحيم دي كان فيها ديبيت كبير، يعني إيه الفرق الدقيق ما بين الاثنين؟ الاثنين نسبة فور، واحد الرحيم زي الرجيم والتاني الرحمن زي الإنسان، يعني كلمة إنسان يعني المنتسب إلى الإنس، كلمة نسوان يعني المنتسب إلى النسوة، كلمة شيطان يعني المنتسب إلى الشيط. فالألف والنون دي هي زيادة محطوطة بمعنى المنتمي إلى، ودي جاية من الأرامك. الحاجة اللي أنا من الأرامك النهاية بس الألف والنون. يعني مثلا لبنان، كل الدول اللي يعني فيها أي حاجة بتنتهي بالألف والنون.
هذا من الهيروغليفية من
الأرامي،
اللغة السامية.
لا الألف والنون دي نهاية.
يقولون العلماء أنا درست، أنا تخصصي الفرعي سبعي، فكان أستاذنا ميلر يقول لنا إنه رحمانان الألف والنون هو بمثابة القلب العربي. لا ليس النسبة العدد. لا
يعني تقريبا بعد اكتشافنا للغات القديمة تقريبا حصل لنا زي ثورة في معرفة أو فهم الكلمات العربية اللي ممكن ما يكونش ليها أصل باللغة العربية.
أشكركم على الصبر وعلى الحضور الكثير، وأرجو أن نكون قد أفدنا جميعا من هذه الخبرة الهائلة للبروفيسور